This is Greg Smythe, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by Global NL. The goal of the podcast is to share stories of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things, both at home in the province and around the world. In this week's episode, we have Florian Villaume, the director of the Memorial Centre for Entrepreneurship, a newly formed department in the engineering school designed to foster entrepreneurship. During the episode, we discuss what brought him to Canada and eventually to Newfoundland from his native France. We discuss his experience working in Africa with Engineers Without Borders, leadership development, as well as challenges and fears that entrepreneurs face, both big and small. Fostering entrepreneurship is such a critical feature to diversify the Newfoundland economy, and Florian is planting the seeds for future leaders and companies. We hope you enjoyed the episode and look forward to sharing more stories like this in the near future. Welcome, Florian Villaume, to this week's episode of the Global NL podcast. We recently changed the name of the podcast to Uncharted Waters. And I couldn't think of a better guest to talk about taking career paths or opportunities in uncharted waters maybe than Florian. He's responsible for the Memorial Centre for Entrepreneurship at the university, and I look forward to talking to him about that as well as some of his background. The focus of the podcast, we do want to talk about people that have kind of taken different paths or done things a little bit more unique, and so hopefully we can talk about that. But with that, I'll let Florian maybe introduce himself and we can get started. Thanks for joining.
I'm very excited to join this podcast and to talk a little bit about the MC, what we do here, and a little bit of my background as well. So I'm initially from Gander, Newfoundland. No, I'm not. I'm initially from France. That's my best joke. And people said, no, you're not. So, no, I'm not at all. I'm initially from France, east of France, and I'm an engineer, mechanical engineer, and I did a master in fluid mechanics in Laval University in Quebec City. And after my graduation, I decided to do something slightly different than my initial trajectory. I left to work for about 6 years in West Africa with Engineers Without Borders Canada. And I was working there with farmers, water and sanitation organizations, and also entrepreneurs. I was managing like a project that was supporting entrepreneurs in Ghana and also in Mali and Ivory Coast. And then I came back to the head office at Engineers Without Borders Canada for about 3 years. Developed a program of leadership called the Kumvana program that invested in a couple of leaders across Africa. And and then I decided to come to Newfoundland for a new challenge. I was getting a little bored and I needed something that could have a very positive impact and change something positively.
Right. No, that's good. I mean, I think so. What was that experience with Engineers Without Borders? You spent, I guess, about 8 years there. It looks like, and I also see you're a consultant for leadership and entrepreneurship too. I'm just curious to know maybe how you tie those things together or what you learned about entrepreneurship through working with Engineers Without Borders. I'm sure it's a very, I'll say, challenging organization, but it's working on some really tough problems in very remote and challenging areas. So I'm curious to know maybe what some of the things you learned about entrepreneurship through that experience.
Yeah, so one of the things is Engineers Without Borders Canada. It's really a group of people, volunteers that are really entrepreneurial, and the intention is really to address the root cause of poverty and try to understand what are the systemic barriers that are created in Canada, in the world, but also in the country the organization operates, that we can address by innovation. So a lot of my journey was around really understanding what are the main barriers, working with people locally on how to create amazing innovation. And one of the best innovation came from really diverse team from cultural point of view, gender, and kind of working on the innovations that really changed some of the barriers there. So, for example, one of the things that we identify is we were working at one point with farmers, and one of their challenge was they were getting together in cooperatives, and they were commercializing their maize together and selling that to kind of big organization, United Nations. And the challenge that they were just farmers with a low level of education. They didn't know the whole management process. So when we understood that one of the key barrier for those farmers to commercialize was to really learn on how to manage a commercialization process in their own way, then what we decided is to create, instead of having a 1-year process for them to learn and fail and have risk to lose a lot of a lot of the benefits, we decided to create a process where they will learn that over a day by experiencing it very quickly. So it's almost like approaching with a lean approach where you try to iterate quickly, learn quickly to then be able to be better afterwards. So that's what we did, and that's the kind of innovation that we worked on there.
Like one anecdote, I remember watching something the Gates Foundation did. They were talking about farmers in Africa, and I was surprised to hear that they were pushing and supporting teaching them accounting too, and how important it was to understand the business portion of farming. And this was something they were reinforcing, that it can't, is certainly seeds and the agricultural part is important, but the business aspect was important to make sure the actual underlying business was sustainable.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So we were working. So I was part of a team that was working with farmer organizations, but there were also some other teams that were working on developing a curriculum to train farmers to do farming to see farming as a business and what are the implications. And there were also some other innovation where some tools were developed and are still being developed on how to track almost your credit as a farmer without having the same credit system here, by tracking their accounting transactions, for example. So that was kind of the main, the thing that we were doing. But there is one thing that I really enjoy, and when I arrived in Africa, I met really amazing and smart people in Africa. And what I realized is that I think I had when I decided to go to become a volunteer, I think I was looking for something different and impactful. And I wanted to also to do some little bit of change in my life, my trajectory. It was kind of an interesting change from my parents to go from a master in fluid mechanics to a volunteer in a village.
Yeah,
but
I'm sure it can be a humbling experience for sure. I have no doubt.
Yeah. So anyway, so I that was also a life transformation journey, and there I met a lot of amazing leaders. And I began to invest in them on their personal developments. And I always been interested in personal developments. I began to learn more from on how to do coaching, leadership. Then I did some training in France and on coaching and leadership development. I read a lot of books. That's something, and it was also on the same time something that I was applying to myself on helping me to become a better leader of this team. And ultimately, I actually started to work as a head office in Toronto.
Yeah. Now, I mean, that's a topic, that I'm interested in too, that I've spent a lot of time just reading about personal development and effectiveness, leadership, all those things. So it's an important part of entrepreneurship, I'm sure, as well. I mean, just general effectiveness, but just especially when you take a lot of, entrepreneurship tends to be pointed at younger folks, and they often don't have the life experience and things on the leadership front. So I'm sure you can help a lot of those new entrepreneurs to develop those skills.
I think one thing that I'm really passionate about. I know there's a lot of content on leadership developments that's more around good practices. And what I found is those good practices could be helpful, but you need to build on your unique style of leadership. Everyone has their own unique style. And what I've been learning is how do you find that style, and more in the creating almost like experiences where you can understood that style, what you're aiming for, what's important for you, your ingredients, your own ingredients, and then you build from it, and you can bring good practices. But I found sometimes like leaders, they try to just apply the good practices, but it's not necessarily authentic leadership, and it's not necessarily sustainable actually.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice too, because sometimes we look externally for answers. You basically want an answer in a book, but most of the time it's like inside of us. You just have to kind of reflect on the style of leadership you are, or leader you are, and be open to how to discover that, opposed to kind of looking for an answer maybe somewhere else.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because when I did my training, they were like no textbook, no presentations. It was purely experiential, and we were working on creativity, curiosity, compassion, and courage in different ways just by experiencing. And when you're part of an experience like this, then you learn how you react and how things resonate or not for you, and then you build on it. Versus sometimes I think the leadership comes from too much from the head versus almost your heart and what drives you. And I think that's when you find that drive, then everything is possible.
Yeah, I've in the last couple of years too, I've tried to follow my instincts more than my head. I don't know if instincts are a better word or a different word for heart or something like that, because sometimes you just intuitively know, I think, what you need to do, and sometimes you can't explain why. You don't really understand it, but there's just there's some intuition that we have that I've tried to trust more and more over the years, and to doubt myself less where possible. Sometimes healthy doubt is okay, but trusting your instincts and just going with something is often better than doing nothing, certainly, because that's often something else where new leaders can get I think paralyzed by not wanting to make a choice, which has its own consequences.
Yeah, no, I think there's something more intangible than we think to leadership, because I think the issue is that from a science point of view. So if I give you an example, for example, you enter in a room and there were like a conflict, and you feel something. It's it's data you receive. You see, even like if you feel there is something there in the you call that the elephant in the room or something, but you feel some energy there. The thing is that we all feel that, and we know it's real, but we cannot explain it. So that's why I think the issue is that we have been trying to explain something that's more intangible, and I think we just need to learn on how to play with the intangible and embrace it, listening to it. So that's the kind of thing that I'm really passionate about, as you can see.
Yeah. No, I am too. I could talk about this all day. I think one thing I've noticed lately is I've been on obviously more teleconferences these days, and certainly Zoom and others have gotten much better. Even just the quality video latency is quite good on this call. But there is like a certain aspect that I really miss of like that data that you get from in-person meetings, and whether it's body language or voice tone or whatever it is. Like I find two things, like I just miss that in-person connection. And I think the other thing is I find it more tiring. It's like a little bit more, it's harder to like express yourself, and it's also harder to get expression from other people. But it is an interesting experience to go through to see how those dynamics are quite different.
Because it's almost like it's an incomplete conversation where you get the tangible, but you don't get the intangible of the energy.
Yeah, it's kind of like watching a TV show in black and white or something like that. I don't know how to explain it, maybe.
Yeah.
So I was going to maybe use this as a segue, but I always look at Newfoundland as like one of its biggest challenges is being an isolate. I mean, there's some advantage of being an island, but being an isolated community has been historically very challenging. I'm curious to know if you saw any parallels. I know Africa is a very different region, but like any parallels from having an isolated region or kind of parallels from your work in Africa when you came to Newfoundland? Because I often thought, software is kind of the new, when we talk about tech, it kind of tends to be software. I think one of the big advantages, you don't have to put software on a truck, and that historically has been a big challenge for any industry trying to be attracted to Newfoundland. But I'm curious to know, did you see any, either remote or, some limited resources to infrastructure, any of those parallels when you first came to Newfoundland?
Yeah, there are some parallels, and I don't want to compare necessarily Newfoundland to a developing country, because it's not. It's much more advanced. But what I saw that was very interesting is when you are in kind of almost isolated place. And when I was in Burkina Faso, it was a landlocked country, and under tough conditions. And here would be the tough weather. I found that communities could be very strong, and that's reflected in the kind of how much people are helping each other. So that's something that I think is one of the things that's unique here that I saw here. And the other thing is that I found interesting, when there is a smaller population, that's the same thing. People tend to it's easier to connect to each other. So that's some of the parallel that I think that I saw also. That was very interesting.
Yeah. No, that's good, and I'm happy to see, because even the software companies that I've gotten exposed to or gotten to meet, some through the MCE and through Global NL, most of them, or none of them, are competing with each other. They're all in the software business, but they're not competing, and so they're although talent is probably the one thing they are competing for, which I know is a big challenge. But they're not, from a business perspective, they're not competing. So you see them kind of working together in many sense, trying to support each other, to learn from each other. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah, I think it's one thing. If I summarize my thought is, I think there are three things that are important, that are powerful in Newfoundland and distinguish ourselves from others. The first one is what I just mentioned, a super connected and supportive community. And there's a lot of support here from organizations that support entrepreneurs, but also from just other startups who want you to succeed. Because I think there is something that's emerging here. It's almost like helping to transform the economy of Newfoundland to attract new resources. That's the first one. I think the second thing is, and it's almost something that people have a hard time to believe, but we have a kind of global successful startups and company, and $1 billion company in Newfoundland. And I think when it was announced last year that Verafin, I'm talking about Verafin, got these large investments, I think it just challenged all the stereotypes of where you can be successful.
Yeah.
And Verafin, they're showing a way that you can be successful anywhere, even on an island, in a small town, in the east coast of Canada. And I think that's a game changer for people to realize that, yeah, you can be almost anywhere and have $1 billion company. And there are also startups now that see that, yeah, you can be successful here. You don't have to be in a large town. And I think the last thing that's kind of the ultimate differentiator is we have an awesome lifestyle. And in 10 minutes, you can be in nature. If you be close to nature, and you may be tired of living in big towns, that's an amazing place to have fun, to raise your family, and to just enjoying life.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things, just to touch on a couple of things here. I do think one of the reasons I think is important is to help transform the economy. I think that's a big part of it. And we don't need, I work or I live a couple of miles from the Facebook campus here. And we don't need a Facebook, although a couple of Verafins could make, I mean, Verafin already has made a material impact on the economy, but a couple of Verafins would have a very big effect on the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think diversifying the economy is just so important. You see with the cyclical nature of oil prices and just the dependency on that for jobs and revenue is just is not a good place to be. And so I think maybe software is a part of that, but entrepreneurship in general, just to fill that void and fill needs, I think is just so critical.
Mm-hmm.
And the other, go ahead.
No, the advantage of software is that, you can do it anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I mean, the challenge, I think that there's a big opportunity, but challenge is that you serve a global market with no shipping cost, but also you compete on a global market. So it's a very competitive market. You know, you're competing with every kid with a computer in the world, or any software company with big bank accounts. But Verafin is an example that's possible, right? That if that wasn't there, you probably would question whether we could compete on that scale. But I think having that is really positive.
Yeah, there are others like Genoa Design, like Cola, Misa.
Yeah,
it's happening.
Exactly. Do you want to tell us more, maybe just at a high level, what the MCE is? We probably should have started there, but maybe you could describe what it is and maybe what some of the key programs are. I know I've been involved a little bit with the World War Cup, and it seems like that's really exploded in the last couple of years with interest and traction. But yeah, do you mind sharing some details about that?
Yeah, sure. So the MC, it's a pan-university center at Memorial University. And our mission is to inspire and help students to come up with their initial startup concept. And what we have been really focusing on is providing almost like the foundational resources, like advices, funding, connections to come up with startup ideas, so more high growth ideas. And the intention behind is, we think that if we really want to contribute to develop the economy as a center, then we need to bring funding from outside versus recirculating the same funding locally. So that's kind of the overall the center. And how we organize it, we are organized like almost like a startup. We have a pipeline and we of students. And what we do is we have two types of students. We have students who are interested in entrepreneurship, don't have necessarily an idea. And what we organize is a series of workshops where they learn the foundational skills. They also meet with startups, local startups, and it creates this kind of excitement. And then if they have an idea, they can meet with our entrepreneur in residence, discuss their idea and progress on it. They can also do an entrepreneurial work term. So that's a very interesting program where you can spend a semester full time working on your idea. You get a bursary of $4,500, and you can get credit for it. So basically, you are paid to work on your startup idea. And I think over the last few years, like we did almost like I think we are at 80 entrepreneurial work terms. And if you like, the most recent thing that we also learn is some students don't have necessarily an idea. And what we found is using this close community, we organize what we call entrepreneurial externships. So what we do is we send entrepreneurial students who are looking for a startup idea within local businesses to identify problems with market potential. So they go there for 2 or 3 days, and we train them before on how to find inefficiencies. And then they go there and they provided the report at the end, and that can give them an idea. Because when you look at some of the successful startups, like more recently, like Heoka, Colab, Inspector, they are all solving inefficiencies. And I think that's an angle that's for the stimulating the students in getting ideas. That's a very interesting area. So that's the externship. So then when they have ideas, they meet with the entrepreneur in residence, and we have some kind of small funding competition that goes from $500 to $2,000. And ultimately, there is this big competition at the Melwood World Cup where one team can win $25,000, and the second one win $15,000. And what's very interesting with that funding is if it's a technology idea, then you can leverage it. So basically, you can get up to $75,000 more if you leverage it, which means you get $100,000 to just work on your idea and have some funding to work on it for about maybe 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of jump in a little bit. Well, like when I was in university, I talk about two things. When I went through the engineering program at Memorial, I graduated from mechanical in 2007. But I kind of joke, one thing was the jobs that were on the co-op placement job board at the time. Like I thought that it was all the jobs in the world, right? I know that sounds kind of silly, but like that was kind of the aperture that you had was these are the opportunities to have available to me. And certainly entrepreneurship was not part of the conversation then. And so you tend to get fun, that we talked about that funnel, I think at the time anyways, like that funnel was quite narrow. It either pushed you into oil and gas or kind of the government opportunities maybe, but those opportunities were relatively narrow. So anyways, I think it's great that now there's like this other path. And some of it, I talked about other fears or not, like understanding how to get people on that track, and maybe reducing the level of uncertainty, or maybe you could talk about that. What are some of the uncertainties that students face? What are the needs you're trying to meet to get them over that hump? It seems like there's this initial hump you have to get students over to think that they can actually do it. I don't know if you can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So there are different dimensions. I think and that's one of the things that I brought from Engineers Without Borders Canada, is we try to understand the system students are on. So there is something in the culture that they are in, and also something at the individual, things we can bring them directly. So at the culture level, one of the key things for the first few years that we focus on is creating that path that you just mentioned, because we felt the same thing. Like what we heard from students, like talking with them is, oh yeah, I want to get a job. And our vision at that point was, okay, we want to make entrepreneurship as a viable and exciting career path. So basically we wanted to add the path of creating your own job as possible. And so that was a big transformation. And now our vision is to become the most entrepreneurial university in Canada. It's another level, but we saw this transformation where people say, oh, it's actually possible. And you get startups like Collab, and that just shows the way and inspiring students to do that. So that's kind of more on the environment, on the culture, because I think that's very important to have the right culture. Then there is at the individual level. So I mentioned we are supporting two types of students who explore entrepreneurship, and the other students who are kind of creating startups. And what we found is what they need when they explore entrepreneurship, it's just some foundational knowledge, skill on how to grow and start on how to start and grow kind of a high growth business. So just getting some basics, and that gives you some just some initial self-confidence. There's also something intangible, which is around inspiration from successful entrepreneurs. Like having something that just resonate with you. So we try to expose students to a lot of startups and different kind of entrepreneurs to find this resonance. And what they also found is, and that's linked to the culture as well, is to have this network of this peer network of entrepreneurial students that they can chat with, because not everyone want to be an entrepreneur. And if you don't have if you don't surround yourself of people who are like you, it will be hard to just focus on it, because you will always have people that you trust that might give you other thoughts. They're not doing necessarily something wrong. It's not their thing. And I think what we have been trying to do is to create this community where entrepreneurial students can meet other entrepreneurial students. And that's kind of the first part. And then when they have a startup idea, it's very different needs. It's about just general startup advising, coaching, and encouragement, more specialized expertise and skills on the legal side, on how to talk to customers, connections to industry, potential customers. And that's where Newfoundland is very interesting, is that there's one degree of separation. Like, it's easy to connect with people. So we have been using that a lot. And also some funding to just develop the idea. And that's what we do with the Medal World Cup and other funding.
Yeah, because I also, when you talked about even just meeting other entrepreneurial students, that I often have like the students over from Memorial for like a barbecue when they're in town here, because typically in Silicon Valley there's between 6 and 8 Memorial students here now, which is wonderful to have like kind of that critical mass of students that are coming back and forth now. But I had asked them about like who they would look up to, or how to describe it, like to help them get over the hump. Most of the time they wanted someone who was just like a little bit ahead of them to understand, like, so someone who's like a year or two ahead. I talked about these people who have been like, say, an executive in a big tech company or something like that. And they just, that path is just way too far from them. So like, say the CEO of Verifin, like that's almost like it's an aspirational thing, but it's like too far removed from where they are right now. And so what they were looking for was more like, hey, who's done this like a year ago? Maybe who's 2 or 3 years ahead of me? Like, what are the barriers that they went through? And I thought it was interesting that like they're not really looking for the beacons. And maybe it's helpful to have the super success stories out there, but most of the conversations they want to have are more folks that are closer to where their current situation is.
Yeah, and that's go for it. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and not that their concerns are trivial, but like, say, for coming to work in Silicon Valley, a lot of their concerns are around kind of more basic administrative things. It's not the big stuff, it's not the work itself. Like, they're just as smart, they can handle the engineering problems. But it's like, can I get a visa? Can I find a place to live? How am I going to get to work? And a lot of those things. And once you talk to someone that's done it, it's like, oh, I can do that. I can get a social security number and some of those things. And once you get over that mental barrier, it tends to be much easier for good students to try something new.
And I think it's very important to meet where students are. And for us, they are our customers. That's how we see it. So, and often, like, for example, if I give you an example of something, sometimes people think they need something before starting a business. One is you need to know much more on the legal side. So we bring in our introductory workshop someone from the legal. It's not because we believe it's necessary at this stage. It's just to bring people at the door because they believe this is necessary. And I think that's one of the things why we had a high level of success is we are highly connected to our students and customers to really understand their needs. And practically what it means is we listen to what's going on, what people say. We do interviews with students. Like, so right now, last week, for example, we wanted to better understand on how to address the specific needs of female students, to attract more female students for entrepreneurship. And we had like 9 interviews, and my colleague listened to it, recorded them, and then we listened to all of them to really understand what are the needs there and how can we do better. And sometimes we even hire students to develop the products with us. And I think that's very important, because at the end, even if we are within university, we still have a certain degree of separation from our customers, and using all those tactics to really being able to design something that address their needs, I think is critical.
Yeah. No, I think that sounds great, and it's just exciting to see. We have, like, in the Global NL Slack group, there's a small chat room it's called the Founder Circle, but it's a group of the founders that a couple have come out of the MCE, and it's exciting to see them supporting each other and communicating back and forth too. So it's nice that there's communities like that where they can support each other or reach out to other people within the network.
Yeah, and it's pretty exciting on how the community grew over the last few years. Like we started like in 2016 with like 20 student ambassadors and students, and now we engage 300 per year. And there are different levels of their interest for entrepreneurship, but it just shows that the interest is really really growing. One of the exciting things that we saw over the last few years is the growth of the community. And it grew from like 20 students initially to about 300 students now. And that shows the interest for entrepreneurship. And one thing that was really a game changer for us was the last year. Like, we were recognized as one of the top 5 entrepreneurship emerging center in the world. And that gave recognition of the growth we had for the last few years. And this award was recognizing new centers that really had an amazing growth. So that really helped us to build the reputation and build momentum, locally, but also getting more attention, even nationally. So I think it opens new things. And honestly, in Newfoundland, we are almost like the outliers, because people think, oh yeah, like in Newfoundland, we hear a lot of kind of more challenging stories. So it's good to show that, okay, there is something very special that's happening here. Yeah. And actually, there's even more recently, CBC commissioned a documentary maker to do a story on what's going on in the community here.
That's cool. I think another couple, like, anecdote. I'm part of this C100 network, which is kind of it's a critical mass of Canadians in technology in Silicon Valley, and I went to their annual conference a couple of weeks ago. And typically, like, Newfoundland is not part of that dialogue. It's typically, Ontario, either Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. Effectively, like, that's kind of where most of that conversation is focused, because the organization here is designed to support entrepreneurship in Canada. Technology startups in Canada, either through like support through advice or investment or those kind of things. But I was impressed that mostly focused on Verafin, because I think Verafin was like the biggest deal in Canada last year, or maybe ever. I can't remember. You
in the history of Canada.
Yeah. And so like that topic came up at least 2 or 3 separate times. And the other anecdote was that, well, maybe you can find talent in these remote parts of the country, like East Coast or something like that. And someone just said, well, when you've got Verafin, you've got a big fish in a small pond, it can be very difficult. So even in those regions are struggling. But I was very proud and happy to hear that we were part of that big conversation, whether it's a beacon or to show it's possible. I think also seeing that if you have a great team and a great product, seeing Collab raise money out here, to get into Y Combinator, the most competitive startup school or whatever you want to call it in the world, and then to get investment from here in Newfoundland is really big. It's a really big deal, it feels like, and I think again that just opens the door. I think right after that, 2 other, I think Brett and someone else came down and interviewed for YC. They didn't get in, but it's like they know it's possible, so they're making a run at it, and they might be successful in the coming years.
And I believe Sequence Bio also was accepted in Y Combinator on the same time. At the same time.
Right. Yeah, I don't know that team quite as well, so I haven't heard as much. But it's great that they're doing that as well.
And Collab was actually the first startup in Atlantic Canada. All provinces to be accepted in Y Combinator.
That's amazing.
That's really amazing, and I think that but we need to we should not stop. We need to keep pushing, and that's what's gonna help us to grow and transform the economy here.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I'm so happy, like Adam and Jeremy are such great ambassadors too. And they went back and shared their story. And I think they're really trying to encourage others to do it. It's just the beginning of that. You also realize how long it takes, to build these companies to be of something like Verafin is like, it's a decade long thing. Sometimes you hear these like, kind of fantasies or these stories about like, these tech billionaires, but these businesses take a long time to build. And, and so I think, and being patient and working through that's really important.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, but I'm curious to know. I know Global NL has been. We started, I think, about 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. We're our own, I guess, social startup in a way, and I'm curious to know. We're still growing and trying to figure out who we are, I guess, in some ways. And our mission is to connect and empower people passionate about Newfoundland and Labrador. One reason we said passionate about Newfoundland and Labrador is we don't want to exclude people like you that might not be from there too, and that people that are there or that just care. We want to be a part to include them in the community. But I'm curious to know, like, how you think that the expat network or Global NL specifically can help support what you're doing or support the entrepreneurship community in general.
Mm-hmm. So I think if we want to accelerate what's going on in the community here, we need to attract students, developers, and startups in St. John's. So that's kind of where the need is necessary, because what we see, and when I say students, is entrepreneurial students in particular. There are a lot of good ideas, and we need more talent. And it's a very good problem to have. It's easier to find talent than finding good ideas and creating startup. But what we see here is that we need more people, and especially expatriates, to come back and work in those startups and company. I know Verafin has a huge demand. So how to do that? I think just coming back to my initial message, just keep promoting the message that Newfoundland is a super connected and supportive community. There are global companies like Verafin, a $1 billion company, and Genoa Design, and also an awesome lifestyle. And I think we need to repeat that all the time and giving an example, because that's what's unique here, and that's how we're gonna develop the economy here, is by bringing back people who care about Newfoundland, because there are opportunities here. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Oh, sorry. It's not really the intention for Global NL to become, say, like a job posting system, but I do think, well, I've always looked at it as like this conduit that we could create connection from the expat community back to Newfoundland, but the Newfoundland community to the, and vice versa. So things can go bi-directional. And that is actually one of the things. And actually this morning I posted one of the MISA job opportunities on my LinkedIn, because the team had reached out to me to say, like, we'd like to use Global NL's network or your network in Silicon Valley, either for people that are, from Newfoundland or interested in working here. And so I do think that's something that we can, I don't know how exactly we can do it, but to start to advertise opportunities, because I think there's two parts. There's a community of expats that have moved away and kind of settled and don't want to move back to Newfoundland. And I'm sensitive to not coercing, but kind of pushing them to move back, because I think it can be a sensitive thing. But there is a community of people that would love to move back if the right opportunity was presented, and I think, and that can be around timing, different times in different people's lives. They want to make those changes or to move back home. And even with this oil and gas thing, you wonder if there's a community of people in Alberta that are looking, that may be affected by this, that would be interested in making a career change, and maybe moving back to Newfoundland would be a very positive thing.
Yeah. I think one thing. Go for it. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so posting jobs maybe I'm sensitive to like just being a job posting board, but I think figuring out a way to help support the entrepreneurship community for connecting to expats, I think is something we should do.
I think, so I think you're already doing it. And for me, like attracting students, developers, and startups is not necessarily, and the message I just shared, it's not necessarily to share that direct message, but it's also highlighting example and stories around it. And I know in the past you had Brett Vokey and Zachary Green talking about their startup and how they are evolving. By doing that, you're just doing what I just said. And I think it's just showing what's going on. Because at one point there will be so much things going on that you might say, oh, maybe I should come back. And I know people are that's another thing I learned is like people are very attached to Newfoundland. So that's a great way to do that. And there are a couple of organizations, because it's, as you mentioned, like in transformation of the economy, they also need to have some transition of some jobs and role. And I know like there are organizations like Get Coding here that can train students, train anyone on learning the basics to work in a startup to help with that transition. And there are other organizations that do that also outside. So there are opportunities to make that transition for the people interested.
Yeah, actually, I think maybe because I'm a little bit more public about some of this stuff, I do get reached out to a lot. I transitioned from oil and gas to Silicon Valley, and that it was like a challenging transition, but at the same time, like the skills are like very transferable depending what your background is. But there is like cultural differences and the dynamics are different, but the skills I learned in the oil and gas industry were very applicable. And I still draw on experience and things I learned from almost 10 years I spent in the oil industry to what I'm doing now. Because there's some things that like being process oriented, making very rigorous database decisions, being structured in certain ways that is very valuable. That the dynamism of a startup can be very exciting and good, but there's drawbacks. Making mistakes are more common, kind of doing other things. And there's some tension, between those two things that I actually enjoy trying to figure out the balance between the two. But I do get a lot of people that reach out to me over the last 3 or 4 years to ask, how did you make the transition and what was it like? What were the challenges? And I actually wrote a 3-page like Word document to write out some of those things, and I've shared that with a lot of folks. And
yeah, so it's a good segue because I my next move from Engineers Without Borders Canada will not have been to work as director of a center for entrepreneurship, but many of the skills that I learned in my experience were highly transferable, and I think sometimes we want to present ourselves in our resume as this role is my natural next step from an history point of view. I think you need to show it from a skills point of view. And that's what I did. Actually, my resume when I applied for this role was I look at the role and I say, okay, what are the 3 things that is important? And then I look at those 3 skills for myself. And so it was basically leadership, entrepreneurship, and the startup development or something like this. I don't remember the third one. And then I began to list all those things that I did, the experiences and the skills that I learned. And then I realized, okay, so these are actually a fit in terms of skills. And if you couple that with a strong ability to learn new things, then you could do a lot of anything things. Right. So that's how I identified I was a good fit, and I think that's at the end. That's how I got this opportunity to lead the center.
Yeah, I think it did take me more. I think you also have these like train track views of the way your career is going to go. You picture it being a ladder, and someone's since described it as like more of a jungle gym than a ladder. But when you sit down and look at the skills or experience you have, and you strip out, I always say strip out like any of the project names, the acronyms, and all these other specific things. You look at what the actual skills or the experience you gained. It's actually quite, there's quite universal in what you're trying to accomplish typically. And, but it does take work and it takes thought to translate some of those experiences over to something new.
And I think there's also something on learning comes back to leadership, on learning how to listening to what resonates with you. Because sometimes when I saw this opportunity, I had it really resonated. I could hear the calling. It was like, oh, wow. And because I learned on kind of listening to that, and I might have asked advices to people around me, and they might have said, oh no, it's not the next step. It's not the natural next step, and it doesn't fit with you because for many reasons. Because not the continuation of your historic path. And I think you need to, if you're really passionate about something, you could do a lot of things and learn a lot of things.
Yeah, I think that might go back to intuition or something too, where I think sometimes you can't just explain it. You're like, I don't know why this is the right thing, but I kind of had to do it. And even if you're wrong at that point, you're still better off doing it than maybe not. And I think I think Mark Cuban's quote is don't ask anyone's advice that doesn't have to live with the consequences. And I thought that was very good because I realized, I talked to a lot of people before I made a career change, and like everyone's kind of got their opinion. But most of them don't have, none of them besides like my wife and I had to live with the outcomes. And so trying to trust yourself more and make those decisions.
Based and there are shared beliefs also in the society that I think are limiting us of what we can do.
Exactly. And I think going back to like what I think we can do, the podcast, I think is actually the thing I'm most excited about. I think the reason is because I think you kind of said something like just shining a light on some of those people. There's so many great stories. Like there is a community of like very famous Newfoundlanders that everyone knows. The Danny Williams or the Alan Doyles or these folks, but there's a huge community of people that I think we need to share their stories with. And I think the podcast is a wonderful way of doing that. We can either share stories of people back home like you or Brett or any of those folks, but also, expats that have been successful or done different things. So I think those things alone, and then the podcast is like, it's a longer form way of doing things, but it's, I think you can kind of tease out a lot more detail and context than you can in some other formats.
When I was in Africa, I have a very funny story. It's a little ridiculous, but I think it explains the point. We see so many things in media about Africa, and like West Africa, and we see poverty and hunger. And when I left, I was very influenced by when I was preparing myself. I said, okay, I need to be ready for this. And I said, like, maybe they don't have a toothpaste. So I bought 7 stuff of toothpaste. And I arrived there, and at the airport, there was someone selling toothpaste. And I said, what's going on? What do I think? And I think you'll be surprised on how the media and the messaging influence what you see and of a specific place. And I learned a lot. I learned so much from people there on many dimensions. But what I found interesting when I was managing a program of bringing leaders in Canada, one of the leaders said, like, what we see in media about Ghana in particular and Nigeria, it's not the reality. And they said, what about if for 50 years we will show pictures of people in Toronto or in St. John's that are homeless, what do you think, like in Ghana, what do you think people from Ghana would think about Canada? And I think there is something powerful in showing the other parts of the reality. And I think for people to have a different perspective. But what I found also is sometimes you repeat the message, even if it's a little more than what it is, sometimes you repeat the message again. And at one point, even people here believe it or anywhere, and then it's happening. That's how things can happen.
I think it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know? I think that's true. Yeah, because I think even when students started looking for job opportunities in Silicon Valley, like I got this sense that like people just didn't think it was possible, you know, and just like that it was, but then all of a sudden, like it just, once you get over that hump or you hear the stories, like it just all of a sudden, like anyone can do it, you know, and now students are just doing it on their own. And it's just like, once you get over that hump and like, anyways, yeah, I think we talked about that already, but yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think the podcast, I think the portion of Global NL that I'm most excited about is this. I think telling either individual or kind of these group or company stories is a wonderful way of doing it. And we can access everybody. Hopefully we can get a community of listeners in Newfoundland, but also a way to engage the expat community as well. You know, we can have a global reach with that.
Awesome.
The last question I have for you is, and this is a different way of asking it, but if you could put a billboard, maybe I was going to say outside St. John's Airport, but if you could put a billboard somewhere in Newfoundland that you wanted to send a message to either the people of the province or the expat community, or maybe a combination of both, you know, what message would you put on that billboard? To tell the community to send some sort of message.
The future is here. I'm saying that because like I think the community, like the startup ecosystem in particular, are starting transformation on the economy side, and I think there's a lot of new kind of this community I think is gonna explode. We're gonna have a lot of more startups, and I think there's also something that people begin to realize that living in big towns, there's a lifestyle issue, but I think we realize also there could be some issues on the health side, and we saw recently on the health crisis that is actually could be a challenge to live in big towns. And more people, I think, will choose to live in smaller towns and have a great lifestyle. And I think, I think there's a new trendy lifestyle that's emerging in the country and hopefully in the world, where you don't have to live in large towns to be successful and fulfilled.
And I think what's currently going on in the world with effectively the whole world either not working or working remotely is a great experiment in that way to see how effective we all can be, you know, and it probably is going to shift some of the paradigms around what can be done from where, you know, in the future. Mm-hmm. and working in these expensive, densely populated places. There are certain benefits to it, but I do wonder if it'll shift some of the paradigms around what's possible and where it needs to be done. I think I really appreciate that message too, because I think it's one of optimism and that there is a lot of opportunity there, although it's in a different area than most people are maybe comfortable with or familiar with, and it's still emerging, right? It's this thing that's still fragile and uncertain that people are not entirely comfortable with. But no, I appreciate that, and I think it's a positive message to send. I think that's all the topics I wanted to touch on. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we sign off?
No, I think that's good. I had a lot of fun chatting with you, and I look forward to hearing more amazing stories from Newfoundland.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for the time. We'll look forward to staying in touch. If there's anything I can do to support you or the MCE, don't hesitate to let me know, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, awesome.
I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode of Uncharted Waters, the podcast brought to you by Global NL. A special thank you to my co-host Jeremy Andrews, editor Hi Nim, and producer Frank Smythe. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to sharing more stories about Newfoundlanders and Labradorians doing interesting and amazing things around the world.